Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up for the past week or so of reading. I decided I would start the year, as I did last year actually, reading a bit of theater, and I read Michel Tremblay's The Driving Force. This is a play set in Montreal. It has 2 acts, and each act represents a different alternative version of reality. There are only 2 characters in this. It's a father and son. The father is 77, the son is 55. In the first act, the father has developed some kind of senile dementia, and the son is going to a nursing home to look after him and have a conversation about the source of his anger towards his father. In the second act, their roles are reversed, and the son has early onset Alzheimer's, and the father, who is healthy, has gone to a nursing home to go and look after him, and talks about the source of stress in their relationship. It's a very interesting look at the way 2 people, even within the same family, can interpret events in completely different ways. The play sets out the 2 men really being similar in a lot of ways, but being so similar in ways that they can't see their similarities for their dissimilarities. It was an interesting read. I think it would be interesting to see it performed, but I thought it was a really interesting take on relationships. Very straightforward. You just have those 2 acts, the 2 actors, and nice piece of writing. I quite enjoyed that. The second thing that I read was also a piece of theater, and that is Bolsheviki, a deadly serious comedy by David Fennario. This is also set in Montreal. This is set in the 1970s, and it is a reporter who goes to talk to a First World War veteran and is treated to kind of rambling, drunk rant about history. This was one of these things that I didn't think was particularly compelling as I was reading it, but I could definitely imagine the kind of interesting things you could do with the production of this, and I thought that was really impressive. This is definitely something that I think is much better on the stage than on the page. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but hey. Because I think that there are a lot of references, for example, in the guy's rants where he's talking about songs that were current during the First World War, when he talks about chants that, for example, communists in Manitoba after the war during strikes, things like that, where if you had it on stage, you could have some of that happening in the background while the 2 characters are talking to each other. But because you're just reading it, you don't have that. You just sort of have the potential. I had a lot of fun thinking about the potential for staging, but I think if you were just reading it without wanting to go through the trouble of staging it in your head, I think it maybe is lacking something, because there isn't a lot of direction, which again I think was great because you could imagine all the ways that you could go with that, but without the stage direction, it's in and of itself was a little empty. And also, depending on if you get the references, there were some references that were very Montreal specific that I didn't get. I read the notes afterwards, and the notes in this are actually just as long as the play, and were definitely worth reading. I thought they were of a great deal of historical interest, and I got a lot of the First World War references. I didn't get a lot of the very Montreal specific references, so I liked reading about them then at the end. But again, if you're reading just the play portion, it's going to be a lot of references that you don't get if you're not from Montreal and familiar with Montreal in a specific period of time. And also, if you're both not familiar with that and also not familiar with Canadian First World War history, I think it's a lot of references to not be getting right away. So in that case, it might almost be better to read the notes first if you were in that position. But yeah, I thought it was very intriguing to think about how that might be produced, but in and of itself, the way it's written, not necessarily a straightforward piece of interest. I also read one comic during this period, and that was volume 1 of Injection. This is written by Warren Ellis and drawn by Declan Shalvey. It is pretty classic Warren Ellis. It's let's talk about technology and religion and politics all together with a snarky and somewhat grumpy multicultural British cast, which, I mean, this is the stuff that Ellis has been writing since the 90s, so it's not new. It's done well, and I enjoy that style of Ellis's writing, so I had fun with it, but there's nothing groundbreaking about it, and the art is good enough, so I don't have much to say about that one. After that, I also read Ken Liu's Star Wars: The Legends of Luke Skywalker. This is a book that is aimed at a either sort of older middle grade or younger young adult audience. It is a series of short stories. The framing device is a bunch of people who work on a trade ship are telling stories about Luke Skywalker. and they come from different sources. They come from droids, from other species, they come from a flea, which I thought was hilarious. So each of the stories has a very different narrative voice. I think this would be such a fun book to read with a child who is between the ages of maybe 5 and 9. And if you still read aloud to them, this would be such fun to read aloud with a kid who has just watched a bunch of the movies. Because it's aimed at the younger age group, this is not going to be as serious as a lot of the adult-aimed Star Wars tie-ins. So I think if you approach it with that attitude, you might be a little disappointed. But I honestly felt like this was the perfect spirit of Star Wars, and I was very entertained by this. I thought it was charming. Next up, I read a book that is the reason that we're here with my dog, because look at the pointer on the cover of this, and then look at my dog. They could be cousins. What It's Like to Be a Dog is not actually a dog book. What this is an exploration of new developments in non-primate mammalian neuroscience. And since I've been on a neuroscience kick, see, even my dog's bored. And since I've been on a neuroscience kick, I really enjoyed reading this. It's not structured in a super compelling way, and I don't think it's sold or marketed in the right way. When I saw this in the bookstore, and I did get this out of the library in the end, but it was on the domestic, like the pets shelf, and it's clearly sold as a dog book. And I think if you went into it hoping to find out more about the way your dog thinks, you're not going to get that, because what this describes is some tests that were done and designed to find out more about how dogs think. But it's really a set of experiments that they've gotten some results, but they're results that are a starting point. They're not results that are an end point. So it's very interesting stuff, but if you want to know what it's like to be a dog, that's not actually what this is about. This also talks about some interesting research into sea mammals and their way of thinking and the ability of, for example, sea lions to keep rhythm, which was fascinating. There's a bit at the end where the author is trying to run MRIs on extinct species, and specifically the Tasmanian tiger. And the style of that is a kind of very old school scientist as adventurer, which I don't think you see much anymore. That's a very kind of 19th century style science. So it was fun to read that, but I didn't think it fit quite as well with the kind of joint behavioral and neurological studies that the dog and the sea lion and the seal studies were. So that was a bit disconnected in terms of the content. And then at the very end, the author goes into a thing about animal rights. And that's one of those things, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with his stance, that's not what the rest of the book was looking at. And so, while I think that's an interesting topic to relate to mammalian or just animal neuroscience, it felt like a strange aside. It didn't fit with the flow of the rest of the book. He talks a lot about Peter Singer, who was very important to me when I first read Animal Liberation as a teenager, but then when I found out how pro-eugenics he is for humans, I was appalled. And so anytime somebody talks about, well, Peter Singer says, I'm like, I don't care what Peter Singer says anymore. But anyway, this was very interesting. If you are interested in non-primate mammalian neuroscience, definitely pick this up. If you were looking to buy this to find out how your dog thinks, that's not what this is, so you might be disappointed. And again, I love the cover, even though it's misleading, because it looks just like him. Right, Bob? Finally, I read Salman Rushdie's Imaginary Homelands. This is a collection of nonfiction writing that he did between 1981 and 1991. A big portion of it is book reviews, which was my least favorite part, but a good chunk of it is general commentary on literature and on politics. I found the political stuff to be really interesting because most of it was written in the early to mid 80s, and there are predictions and assumptions that he's making, some of which ended up coming true, some of which did not, and it's just a really interesting look at this particular point in Indian politics and in British politics, because those are the two main focuses that he has. I don't know how interesting that would be if you are not at least vaguely familiar with Indian and British politics of the 1980s, but they were definitely a highlight for me. The other highlight, I think, was one of the essays in here was one that he wrote about Midnight's Children after it won the Booker Prize, which I found really interesting. And that was about how after it won, he felt that people were looking at it as a history and less as a novel. and how a lot of the things that he wrote in that book are bits where, because memory isn't a perfect reproduction of things that actually happened, a lot of what's written about in the book is supposed to be through the eyes of the character who might be misremembering things. So there are bits that are intentionally wrong, because part of the point is that he's not remembering these things correctly. And he actually says there are a couple of points where it's not actually a character error, but he misremembered something when he wrote the book. And instead of correcting it in later editions, decided, no, the character would have misremembered that the same way that he did, so he leaves that misremembering in there. And I thought that was brilliant because, of course, that is what memory is like. I did think it was funny because I've seen a few people who are doing international challenges trying to read from every country or from different countries, and a lot of that gets discussed in terms of an educational experience. And I think this makes the point that it's dangerous to do too much of that, especially if you're not familiar with the history outside of the context of any one particular piece of fiction. I think it's a nice warning to not assume that just because you're reading something in a novel that it is 100% representative of history, and that there was no artistry that ended up taking precedence over the actual history. So I quite liked that. In addition to the book reviews, there are some pieces in here that are just musing on certain authors. I really liked the one about Günter Grass, which frames his writing in terms of the migrant experience as opposed to just the German experience, which I thought was really interesting. That was worth reading. There are also some essays in here about the reception, or rather poor reception, for the Satanic Verses, which again are interesting, but was so close to when it came out that I don't think it's as interesting as it would have been if he'd written them with more distance. Yeah, it was an interesting read. I wouldn't say everything was particularly thrilling, but I quite liked it. Good. All right, so that was my week or so in reading. I've apparently bored my poor dog to death. So anyway, I hope you had a good week and a good weekend. That's it for now. Ciao.